I'm happy to see you all again. Actually, I can't see any of you, but I know you're there. And so today we're going to talk about the heroes that we find in Genesis. Now, superheroes are a little bit different. Superheroes are imaginary characters that have been thought up for cartoons. And they have all kinds of things they can do. They can stretch, they can go through walls, they can do all kinds of things. But the heroes in Genesis were mostly regular, ordinary people. And so you can be a hero also. But think about how you can become a hero. Maybe by following Jesus and just doing what's right. Now, one of my RCIA kids asked me, RCIA are older children who have not yet been baptized, asked me if Jesus had superpowers. Well, she was thinking of the cartoon characters. And I said, well, if you count healing the sick, making the blind to see, raising the dead, yes, that would be superpowers. But Jesus is not a superhero. Jesus is God. So mostly regular people like us. And we'll start with the creation story. Now, I want to make sure that I set my timer because these superheroes, or these heroes of the Bible, may take longer than we expected. Yes, we are doing just fine. So there's two creation stories. One is in chapter 1 and one is in chapter 2 of our very first book of the Bible, which is Genesis. Now you have to ask yourself, why would there be two stories? Okay, so imagine yourself without a television, without any kind of entertainment, and that at night you could sit around a fire and listen to stories. Well, if everybody was sitting around different fires listening to stories, then you are pretty sure that some of the stories might be a little different from each other. For example, we have Peter Rabbit, and we know that story never changes because it's published. But we have other stories like the Three Bears, which have many, many different versions. So these two creation stories are what really happened, but they're told from different perspectives. The first one is a big water story. So you can imagine an ocean in which there's nothing but chaos. And the Spirit of God is floating on the water. Actually, it says that it's nesting on the water, like a mother hen would be nesting on her eggs. So there's a lot of water in that story. Now, here's another story which you don't see any water on the land at all. What's happening is that the water in chapter 2 is all underground. And then the water comes up, maybe from wells or maybe from the earth dipping a little bit. And so that's a different kind of water story. And from the water coming from underground, suddenly there's 4 major rivers that we have to discuss. And one is called Gihon, another one is Asher, and then here's 2 you've heard of, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So our first creation story tells us all about the big ocean of water and the firmament that was created over that ocean. The second one is a land story where water comes from underground and comes out in 4 beautiful rivers. And the Tigris and Euphrates, you can still see them today. Now, the first people are Adam and Eve. And there's a very famous poem which takes a long time to read, and it's called Paradise Lost by John Milton. And he just describes in the most beautiful detail how wonderful it was when God created the earth and how happy Adam and Eve were together, just walking with God in the garden. And the Bible doesn't spend a lot of time with how happy they were because it gets right into what happened was the temptation and the fall. And Satan was a snake. He came in the form of a snake. He can also come in other forms, but let's concentrate on the fact that he came in the form of a snake, which can also be called a serpent. And Adam and Eve had one rule and one rule only. You can eat anything in this wonderful garden, but do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because on the day that you do that, you will die. That was God's commandment. And we know that God meant the best for them. But like God always does, when someone makes a big mistake, God takes the mistake and he often turns it into something we can learn from. But this was a really big mistake because Eve believed what the snake told her instead of going to God in prayer or saying, God, I have something I have to kind of run by you. This doesn't seem quite right to me. And Adam went ahead and followed Eve, and they both sinned because they both believed the snake and stopped trusting in God. Then they started hiding from God. So it didn't take God long to figure out what had happened, because now that they had the knowledge of good and evil, they weren't really fit to live in a perfect world anymore. So God said, you're out of the garden. I'm going to place some cherubim and seraphim and whoever else I need to place outside the garden so that you don't come back in until you're ready. Wow, that was really sad time for Adam and Eve. And you see a lot of pictures of Adam and Eve sorrowfully walking out of the garden, looking back, and they can't get back in. And I think that all of us love gardens because we kind of have a longing for that beautiful garden that God created for us and that we will go back to when we get to heaven. So this is called the fall. F-A-L-L, how we fell from grace. We've been kind of looking out for a way to get back in God's good graces ever since. But you know what? God takes care of that. He wants us to be with him. So God is taking care of the redemption after the fall. It gets so complicated. But let's go back to the ancient stories, because there were two men who were sons of Adam and Eve, and their names were Cain and Abel. Now, Abel was a shepherd. That means that he took care of sheep, goats, oxen, any kind of grass-eating animal that needs a lot of land to wander in. But then Cain was a farmer. He used the land very differently. He liked to plant wheat and barley and rice and whatever would grow in the land. Now, you probably might be able to figure out a little conflict here, because the way that Cain used the land was completely different than the way that Abel used the land. And they both made sacrifices to God. So Cain needed fences so that his land would not be run over by all these animals. And what Abel needed for his sheep and goats was lots and lots of land. So there's always been like the farmer and the cowman should be friends, you know. There's always been a little bit of a conflict the way people use land. And so with Cain and Abel, we could really see that. So they both made sacrifices to God, and Abel's sacrifice was pleasing to God, but Cain's sacrifice was not pleasing to God. Why? We don't know. We don't really know why some sacrifices are pleasing to God and some are not. But Cain was so jealous that he killed Abel. And he was one of the first of many people. Well, actually, Adam and Eve had already tried to hide from God. So Cain tried to hide from God. He buried his brother and he thought, with enough dirt on top, I don't think anybody's going to notice. But God said, where's your brother? And Cain said a very famous line, am I my brother's keeper? Am I the one supposed to be watching out for my brother? Well, of course. We're all supposed to be watching out for our brothers and sisters and family members. So Cain killed Abel. That's one of the sins that came into the world with the fall, people killing each other. But more children were born, and the Bible says at that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. When they say men, that means men and women, but that's just the way they used to talk. So men and women began to call on the name of the Lord, meaning that people figured out God is there and God wants us to call on his name. So now we're going to jump ahead to chapter 6, and we got the Nephilim. The Nephilim. Who are the Nephilim? They are called heroes of old, men of renown. That almost sounds like something from like the elves or the dwarfs, you know, from the Lord of the Rings. But they were called Nephilim the heroes of old, men of renown. And then in chapter 10, there was a man named Enoch who walked with God. And the way that works out, what does it mean he walked with God? Does God have feet walking? No, what it means is that Enoch was taken right into heaven. Got a couple of other people that were taken right into heaven. One is Enoch, who walked with God. He was taken and was no more seen on the face of the earth. And then we have someone else named Elijah, who was taken up to heaven in a chariot, a flaming chariot. So that's pretty impressive. Then our tradition tells us that Mary was taken into heaven. And of course, the disciples saw Jesus taken into heaven when a cloud covered him. So Enoch walked with God. Jeremiah was taken into heaven. Mary was taken into heaven. Jesus ascended into heaven. So we have some very exciting things that are starting to take place way back in the book of Genesis. Now Enoch, before he walked with God, he had a son named Methuselah. Now you'll find that all these heroes of old lived, at least 100 years. Nobody could tell a story in those times without people living at least 100 years. That was a kind of a pretty big deal. The older you got, the more respect you had. So we'll say that Methuselah lived 900 years. And he would, of course, have been the oldest person in the whole Bible. Like even Adam only lived 130 years. So you can just imagine what an exciting life Methuselah must have had. So we'll say that he lived 900 years. Then Genesis 10, when we jump ahead, we find out Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Nimrod, the mighty hunter, it says he was the first potentate. So potent means powerful. So he was one of the first powerful people. He was probably a governor of a lot of land. Nimrod, the mighty hunter, would like to have known, wouldn't you like to go on a hunting trip with Nimrod, the mighty hunter? Maybe with bows and arrows, and see what kind of animals he would shoot for dinner? Probably some pretty big animals. That's like the cave drawings where you see pictures of people rounding up animals so that they could have animals meat for dinner. That was Nimrod, the mighty hunter. But before you know it, we meet someone named Noah. Noah, Noah. He was mighty because he trusted God. And he's described as the only righteous person that was left on the earth. And God decided to destroy the earth. He'd had enough of all these people who would not obey the Lord, and they were just very, very sinful people. So Noah was chosen to build an ark. The ark had a lot of capacity. It was really huge. Some people even say you can find the ark if you go to a certain mountain, but I don't know which mountain you'd go to find it. I just believe that God created an ark. Well, he told Noah to create it. And the ark had room enough for 2 of each kind of animal. But if you read the story carefully, you realize that if it was a clean animal, that means it wasn't, it could have been a goat, or it could have been a cow, or it could have been a sheep, but it couldn't have been something like a pig or a snake. If it was a clean animal, they would have 7 of each. And I don't know if that meant 4 women and 3 men, or 3 women and 4. I really don't know how that divided up. But 7 is such a perfect number that they wanted 7 of each of the clean animals. I hear my timer. That gives me just enough time to tell you about someone named Terah. Terah had 3 sons, and their names were... What were their names? The names of Terah. Okay, their name was Nahor. We'll hear more about him. Abram, who had no child. Nahor had some children. Abram, who so far had no child, and Haran, the father of Lot. So Lot was the nephew of Abram. You'll hear more about Abram and Lot. So next time we're going to find out about Abram, who was a friend of God. and it was counted him for righteousness. Thank you for joining me for some of my favorite people who are the heroes of the book of Genesis, back when you used to tell stories around the fireplace.